Alright guys, it's that time again. Time for Meta Mondays. So this is a very exciting one because this is the first time we get to look at the stats, the win rate stats for the new decks in the new expansion, and they are going to be quite interesting. So before we get into this weekly meta breakdown, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the hell is happening with my hair. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of theory-crafted decks we had last week on the site, or if you watched the video last week, we just kind of had like a bunch of pure theory-crafted decks ready to go for the new patch, and unfortunately, like I always do, I kind of bit off more than I could chew because I made 15 different decks, and I kind of planned on like day 1 and 2 to very quickly try to update them. I wanted to play every deck and then update all of them to make sure that, you know, within a day and a half of the new patch, all of them would be kind of like tweaked and made sure that they were fine, because of course when you have theory crafted lists, you know, you expect they're going to be a bit off. You know, you need to actually play with them to get the ratios right. Unfortunately, that didn't end up working out, and because we had 15 different lists, it actually kind of lagged a little bit behind the process of getting them up to speed. Of course, some of the decks we theory crafted were almost exactly on point, just had to change literally 1 or 2 cards in the last week. Apart from that, we were pretty dead on. Of course, some of the other decks that we made were kind of janky and in need of some tender loving care, which I was not able to provide for them because, of course, I was kind of trying to juggle too many balls at once. So for, you know, several days, we had some kind of like outdated, semi-janky list on the site, and that's my bad. That's something that I personally pride myself on, is keeping this very, very up to date. Like, as soon as I like, there's a slight tweak, couple cards here that'll increase win rate, I change it. And I've always been very, very good about that, but just for the past week in this super hectic time, I unfortunately kind of slipped up. So my apologies, guys. I've learned my lesson here. So with that out of the way, we can get to the good stuff. So as always, if you check in the pinned comment, there's going to be a link to the stats that we are going to be using for this episode's breakdown. A couple of things about this week's stats. As always, these are from the Mobalytics deck tracker. However, this week we are using the full deck tracker stats from any user all over ladder, unlike every other week where we have been using Masters specific stats. The reason for this is because there's only several hundred people that have gotten to Masters yet in the, you know, ladders, basically just anyone who's been like climbing, and because of that, we don't have a big enough sample size to accurately get anything viable from master stats. So these are all over ladder. What that means is we kind of have to take it with an extra grain of salt. But if you want, you can check it out in the pinned comment, or, you know, read it along as we go. But I'll be referencing all the stats in the video. Second thing is that if there's a deck that you saw here last week, maybe for the 15 decks thing, and it is no longer here anymore, that's because we decided the deck was somewhat inviable. Now, what I want to be clear about is it doesn't mean that the deck is lower than tier 3 necessarily. It's just that the properties of the deck kind of no longer make sense when combined. A good example is the Twisted Fate Lee Sin deck, or the like Twisted Sin deck, I think I called it, which upon further examination is a pretty cool deck, but between like Lee Sin Vi as well as between, you know, Twisted Fate and other decks, there's just better ways of using both component champions overall, so I ended up removing it, even though it would probably be, you know, not necessarily terrible. It probably is something like low tier 2 or high tier 3. Alright, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I'm going to be going deck by deck, starting from the top, talking about deck's win rate, what it's kind of like doing, why it's positioned there, and what some of the specific card choices are. So at the very top of tier 1 right now, we've got Bannerman coming in with a very low sample size so far. It's been seeing almost no play very early on. Like, for the first couple of days, everyone was playing, you know, the Scouts deck and a lot of the new cards, but in the past couple of days since then, people have been ramping up more and more just full Demacia Bannerman, and it comes in at a 64% win rate overall, albeit at a very low sample size. So yeah, basically, to nobody's surprise, Bannerman is a good deck. Turns out Grizzled Ranger and Loyal Badger Bear are good cards. This is a meme. This Reddit meme aged very well. What we hope the meta will be versus what it will actually be. This is, again, can't stress enough, to nobody's surprise, Bannerman, hey, it's a pretty good deck. Now, there's a lot of, like, you know, viable strategies in tier 1, so it ends up being, like, pretty fair, but I do expect something like Grizzled Ranger to probably receive a little bit of a nerf moving forward. Anyway, overall, with Loyal Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger, this deck feels basically like it just has more power options, more sustain, and more overall value. We're running a lot of kind of the same cards as we have been in the past, but with a couple of extra Rangers Resolves, we can do pretty well against certain like board sweep type effects, and a single Purify feels pretty great in the mirror. Honestly, you can go up to 2 Purifies if you're seeing a lot of mirrors. It's a pretty good way to stop the Badger Bear from coming out of Grizzled Ranger. In this case, we're running 1 Unyielding Spirit over the kind of old Bright Steel formation. They sort of represent a very similar thing. Basically just, you know, having kind of an insurpassable board in the late game. The nice thing about Unyielding Spirit as compared to Bright Steel, or did I say Protector? I meant Formation if I said Protector. Bright Steel Formation. The nice thing about Unyielding Spirit is that you can play it earlier than turn 9, which is a really, really big deal. It's great on Fiora, it's great on Garen, it's great on just kind of like any big unit that just needs to be hitting value over and over again. And next up, we've got Burn Aggro. So this is a deck that has been doing pretty phenomenally well. In the meta, you might have seen this, well, literally everywhere in Ranked in the first couple of days, and for good reason. It comes in with a 66.5% win rate, even ahead of Bannerman, although, of course, this win rate is on decline, and Bannerman is going up. So I want to clarify one thing about this week's win rate stats. Much more than any other week, these stats are very, shall we say, open to interpretation, right? You'll notice some very, very specific trends in the stats, especially if you kind of look at them yourself. For example, because we are tracking all stats, not just Masters players, there's some pretty large statistical biases. One great example of which is that decks that you'll see that existed before the patch, as opposed to brand new fresh decks, have much higher win rates than brand new fresh decks. And part of that might be due to like less optimization. I think that's actually mostly due to the fact that there are more new players playing the brand new decks, because that's kind of what they're searching, whereas like older returning players are going to be playing kind of their same decks from before and achieving better win rates because, you know, they have more experience as a player. Anyway, what this means here is that, you know, even though this deck has a slightly higher win rate than Bannerman, if I had to pick, I might rate it slightly below Bannerman. Honestly, though, they're very close, so no big deal. Anyway, I thought I'd clear that up because there's going to be, it's not just like literally a win rate tiering. We are somewhat, you know, extrapolating and thinking about what's going to happen moving forward. Anyway, to the burn list. So this is a very, very quintessential burn deck. We are using standard burn with all the new tools, 3 Noxian Fervor, and of course 3 Imperial Demolitionist. This is a very, very powerful list. It's doing extremely well, and I think it will continue to do extremely well. Now, Runeterra has always kind of been in a meta state where aggro as a concept has been very much like present in the metagame, but never really super tier 1, right? It's always kind of been floating around like maybe the bottom of tier 1 or maybe the top of tier 2, just like right around that point. But with these 2 new tools, Fervor and Demolitionist, we might be seeing that punch through that aggro has always needed. It might be tier 1 to stay here. All right, moving up to the next one, Karina Control. So Karina Control, as always, has kind of been like a staple in past metas, this time with a bit of an upgrade. This is Alan's version of Karina, and we have the new cards, Vi, as well as Gotcha, that are going to be kind of helping this deck stall out in Control. Vi is one of the best new champions. Her ability to just be kind of like a free 2-for-1 trader with Challenger, stabilize like kind of like mid-game spots for like mid-range or even more control-y style decks is pretty great. She fits in most P and Z decks. You can run her in a lot of stuff, and she is basically kind of like a supercharged Thresh in a deck like this. Ultimately, I've seen a lot of people asking me like what I think about Control's position in the metagame, and I would say, and this is actually pretty important, I would say it's fairly simple. Right now, the only region that has actual significant Control tools is Shadow Isles. And this has actually basically always been the case for Runeterra. A lot of people see like Karma Ezreal as a control deck, when in reality it's a combo deck. It's gonna be a little bit different. It plays a bit stally, but it's not like a full control deck. Shadow Isles, you know, there are some other regions that have some control tools, but there's none that has enough to actually sustain a control strategy outside of Shadow Isles. Maybe one exception could be like a Yasuo deck. Yasuo could be like a control strategy. But apart from that, it's really, really, really difficult to actually have a control strategy. So the way control is kind of going to work in Runeterra metagames, at least as far as we can see right now, is the best control deck is going to be Shadow Isles plus X. And it could be PNZ in the form of these kind of like Karina style decks. Could be Karma. We've seen like Spooky Karma in the past. I think that kind of like Ionia style Shadow Isles control is probably on its way out here. Could be Bilgewater. We've got another Bilgewater Shadow Isles control list that we're going to show you a little bit later in this video. Or it could honestly potentially even be something like Freljord, right? We've seen, you know, like Tryndamere style, like Shadow Isles Freljord control decks. Basically, my stance is that in every meta we've seen, there has been a Shadow Isles plus X control deck, and I don't think that's going away. So the question here, you know, is which Shadow Isles plus X deck is going to be tier 1? Is it going to be PNZ? Is it going to be Bilgewater? Well, right now, PNZ seems to be performing the best out of them. And this deck is coming in at a 63% win rate. Sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. Okay, next we've got Karma Ezreal. So Karma Ezreal obviously gone through some pretty significant upgrades with Eye of the Dragon, as well as Concussive Palm, as well as Deep Meditation. This is giving Karma Ezreal basically everything it needs in the new patch. Now its win rate is actually a little bit low this week, coming in at 57%. Pretty bad. Now you might ask, well, Swim, why do you have it here in tier 1? Tier 1, you're saying, you know, often 60+%. What's going on? Well, basically, we had a very warped meta for the first several days of the patch. Typically, what you'll find in the early days of a patch, and I'll refer to my triangle down here, which is aggro beats combo, combo beats control, control beats aggro. Typically, you'll find like a sort of phase-based like wave of new decks. Most new decks that are performing very well early on are aggro. We saw that in the form of burn, as well as like kind of like scout aggro. And then, you know, a little while after that, the control decks start to get refined and counter them. And then at that point, it's kind of like an easy ramp up for combo decks like Karma Ezreal to come in and beat the control decks, right? So I think that Karma Ezreal had a really, really hard time in like the early days of a patch, and I expect it to get quite a bit better, especially with all their new tools, as soon as the meta kind of like stabilizes and finds a bit more of a place for it. But yeah, hopefully you guys can see like how open to interpretation a lot of these stats are, because there's always going to be a lot of specific patterns that the meta will like take and shift, and there's always going to be reasons that certain win rates are lower or higher than others. So it's not like we can very simply just be like, oh, this deck has the highest win rate, play this, because there are going to be a lot of flaws with that approach. Anyway, I think that this is going to be a very, very good deck, and I expect its win rate to go up to maybe something like 60% in the next week. Overall, these new tools are really, really powerful that got added to Ionia, specifically Eye of the Dragon, Deep Meditation, some of the Lee Sin package, and Concussive Palm as well. All cards are very, very powerful, maybe most notably Eye of the Dragon, which gives Ionia a very valuable way to kind of stall out the early game. It's a crazy card for basically 1 mana. Absolutely, absolutely ridiculous card. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Heimer Vi. So this version in particular doesn't have win rate stats, although Heimer's win rate overall comes to 56%, definitely lower than this version would be able to achieve. Basically, we're using just like very, very powerful PNZ mid-range tools with some of Ionia's new kind of like spell synergy tools like Claws of the Dragon and Deep Meditation. Again, this one is not something that there is going to be like win rate stats on yet, because it is kind of like newly hitting the ladder, but I've been talking to, you know, a lot of like other top level players, and a lot of people agree that this is one of the biggest decks to look out for in the upcoming week. Overall, you'll notice actually a little bit of a pattern here, which is that Ionia and PNZ is a pretty good color combination. There's a lot of different ways to run that color combination. Anyway, Misfortune Scouts. So there's several different builds of Misfortune Scouts. This one in particular is using Bannerman. There have been a lot in the start that experimented with like not using Bannerman, and then I think slowly more and more versions just ended up switching to Bannerman overall. This deck has actually done pretty well. I went on the record like with Quinn saying that I didn't think this card would be very good, and honestly I underrated her. She's actually pretty alright. I still do think though that and this is something I was saying like in the early days of the patch, like on day 1 and day 2 of the patch, I suspect that, you know, this deck will kind of slowly be replaced by kind of like a more mid-range deck using Garen instead of Quinn, and that seems so far to be coming true. There were a ton of kind of like this style of Demacia for the first 2 or 3 days of the patch, and now for the past day or two we've seen much more just full mid-range Bannerman with something like Garen. And the reason for that is that Bannerman tends to beat this deck really hard. Your extra attacks with stuff like Relentless Pursuit, stuff like your scout units, is going to be very useless against, you know, a board with just bigger bodies in general, right? That being said, this deck does boast statistically the highest win rate out of any of them at 68%. Of course, this is across several different variations of the list. I think a large part of this was basically just like in the early days of the patch. Any sort of aggro list like this or burn will capitalize on these very chaotic environments where people are running very greedy lists, like a ton of like the day 1 like Maokai and sea monsters type stuff. This list basically can't lose to, and I think that's a large part of where it gets that win rate. I was talking with my friend Prismat, who's, you know, he's a really smart guy, and, you know, we talk a lot about like where the meta might go, and he agreed that like this kind of list would slowly be on its way out and kind of like being replaced by kind of the more like mid-range Bannerman Demacia, which is, you know, where I'm projecting things are going to be taking, which is why I have Bannerman a little bit ahead. Of course, they're both in tier 1. I really want to stress, like, at the end of the day, I do try to kind of like, generally speaking, order these by kind of like ranking, but it's very important to understand, like, the reason we use tierings instead of anything else is because at the end of the day, like, everything in tier 1 is going to be pretty much on the same power level, right? Like, I can say Bannerman is a hair better than Burn Aggro, and I can say Burn Aggro is a hair better than Karina Control, but honestly, like, they're basically going to be about the same, right? Like, if we're imagining that these are pure direct to win rate, which they're not, but if we are, then the range of win rate in like tier 1, in terms of kind of like where we would be in a literal win rate system, would be like 5% or something like that. So each tick on this would represent like 0.7% win rate or something like that. Something really small that won't make a difference to anything. Anyway, I think it's very helpful to refer to this like little chart down here. I've been meaning to update this for honestly quite some time. A lot of people look at this and they ask, well, where's mid-range? Mid-range is between aggro and control, pretty much. So I would put it like right here. In reality, there's kind of a spectrum between aggro and control. If you put mid-range in the middle, then you might be asking, okay, so what does mid-range beat combo if it's in the middle, or does it lose to combo? And in reality, it's like, if it's closer to aggro, then it's going to be favored against combo. If it's closer to control, then it's going to be unfavored against combo, right? It's a spectrum, this entire like area. So ultimately, the idea of a deck like this is, you know, just think about it in terms of like this kind of triangle. It is kind of like an aggro deck. It will be unfavored against its mid-range counterpart. Cards like Relentless Pursuit are really good against combo, and they can be pretty good against like some kinds of control, but overall, this kind of card will blow out an opponent that can't really stop you, right? But against like a mid-range like deck, this card will be completely useless, which is why Bannerman doesn't run it, because it ends up being a hard brick in the mirror. So it's just, I think it's really important to understand kind of the relationship that these different decks have, and, you know, which of them counter each other. And then lastly, for tier 1, we have Lee Sin Vi, which is a deck that comes in on these stats at 58%. This was actually a like modified version of one of the decks that we had, you know, on the page. That was our Lee Vi deck, and out of the ones that we kind of like put up in like Theorycraft, it actually did pretty well. Ezreal Karma did, you know, 57%. That's pretty good. I think that like there's a couple different variations that are only going to be a couple of cards off. This one, 58%, actually comes out a little bit ahead, but I think that the version we put through was a little suboptimal. This version is running Submersible, which looks kind of like a joke card, but I actually think that this card is quite legitimate. And I think that this version could be touched up a little bit too. I actually plan on experimenting much more with this concept, but I actually think that Lee Vi has become, in my opinion, probably the best way to use Lee Sin, although that remains to be seen. But right now, this is a list that will flip him very quickly. You'll be getting Vi triggers very quickly, and then you've got kind of Submersible to be a pretty big late game bomb that's going to be very reliable here as well. So ultimately, it's another deck whose win rate we expect to go up a couple of points as it is shifting to kind of like more refined versions. Okay, so that's tier 1. As you can see, there's a pretty good amount of P and Z in tier 1 in a lot of different forms, although some of that is going to be kind of condensed out. Usually tier 1 is going to be shrinking down as we go along. So next week is probably not going to have 7 entries, but we'll see. Now, one thing you'll notice if you've been playing for a while is that there's not a lot of super brand new decks in tier 1, right? Like Heimer Vi, it's kind of like a Heimer deck with a new champion in it, not crazy new. MF Scouts isn't crazy new, and Lee Sin Vi is probably the most like new deck here, and even this one is, I guess, closer to the bottom of tier 1 if it matters. Ultimately, I don't think that this is a byproduct of like newer cards being like weaker or less synergistic. I actually expect this is largely, not entirely, but largely caused by just newer concepts not being completely optimized yet, for the most part. Then we've got Keg Control, which is actually a pretty cool deck. I have a lot of fun playing this. It's very versatile and you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. Really quite difficult to play, can be a little intimidating, but yeah, super fun deck nonetheless. So it's, like I said, one of the categories of like Shadow Isles plus X. In this case, the X is Bilgewater, and we're going to use Kegs in conjunction with basically anything that scales really well with them. Mostly that's Withering Wail, as well as Twisted Fate for the potential red card, but it also works with Make It Rain, and the Drains, you're going to be dealing extra damage with them as well. So it's a very tricky deck to play. You have to plan ahead quite a bit. I actually think that there is a chance that this could end up being better than the Karina deck. I'm not going to say it's necessarily likely. That's why I have it tier 2 instead of tier 1. But I actually think this is a pretty high potential deck, especially if it gets a little bit more refined. Although personally, I am very happy with this list as it is. Kegs, actually, I didn't really love the idea of like Kegs or Gangplank as a concept until I played around with this list. I definitely ended up underrating this card. So basically, I guess if there's one tip here, I would say make sure to try to, when your opponent removes your Kegs after you've played a spell, then your spell will get, you know, it won't get buffed by the Keg, right? If they kill the Keg while your spell is in the air. So what you kind of always need to do against any deck that has a common response for it, you know, like PNZ or Noxus or whatever, what you need to do is you need to only try to use a Keg for damage when you have a second spell in your hand that you can use after they kill your Keg to use your Keg, you know, before their spell can kill your Keg, if that makes sense. Not always you should do that, but that's a very, very common line of thought for this deck. Again, if that didn't make sense to you, like I said, this deck is pretty tricky, but one of the most rewarding decks in the entire game, and it's using Twisted Fate, slowly becoming one of my favorite champions. He's very powerful and super rewarding, so I think a lot of you guys will have a ton of fun with this deck. Next up, we have new elusive OTK. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, this keg deck doesn't have stats. It hasn't been played enough on ladder for there to be stats for it yet. Honestly, I mean, if you guys are interested in playing it, there will be stats enough to see what its win rate is going to be next week. Anyway, this is new elusive OTK. A deck so disgusting, apparently, even I downvoted it on Mobalytics. I don't remember doing that, but apparently I did. Okay, so a lot of you guys hate me for this deck. Alright. Listen. Apparently there's been a lot of people that are playing it after the update. I personally am kind of surprised by that. I was just publishing it as like a climb to the ladder at the end of the season. I didn't expect for so many people to play it on ladder, but there's been quite a few people still playing this deck on ladder, and it actually has achieved a 62% win rate. Wow, that's pretty high. Now you might be wondering, well wait up, Swim. 62? Why is this in tier 2? Well, I think that's actually because I expect the win rate of this deck to go down a little bit. And listen, look, I mean, I'm trying to be as impartial as possible. I try to, remove myself from bias as much as humanly possible, which is, not entirely, but again, as much as humanly possible. And as much as I love this list, as much as this list is my baby, it is ultimately, I don't think, a list that will be able to maintain tier 1 for a long amount of time. It's fairly like high variance driven. Well, basically, like I was saying, a lot of the lists that existed before that didn't even really need to change kind of have inflated win rates because none of the new players are playing them. It's basically everyone that just climbed to Masters or was in Diamond is playing this list, so they have a pretty high win rate with it. I don't expect this deck to be able to maintain an above 60% win rate long term. That being said, that also doesn't make it a bad deck by any stretch of the imagination. There's nothing wrong with tier 2 decks. They're very powerful. They're literally a couple win percentage points off from tier 1. It's a great deck. You're going to win games really fast. Personally, I find this deck very fun. I think that's because, I don't know, I'm a degenerate. I think there's something wrong with me. I probably just didn't get enough love as a kid. I honestly don't know. But for some reason, the idea of playing this list is entertaining to me. And I don't know why that is. Objectively, it shouldn't be. There's no component of this deck that I can look at and I can say, oh, that makes sense that a human being would find that fun. It's kind of like how I run into like Bannerman players and I kind of don't get how they would find this fun. But that being said, I'm even worse. I find this fun. I don't know. Again, listen, it's a dumb deck. It's kind of high rolly. Ship it in. Very, very disgusting. But yeah, you're not always going to get the sick draw combo that'll win you the game on turn 4 or whatever. Basically, I guess I should clarify the combo if you haven't seen it. It's just like standalone with Relentless Pursuit on like a Zed or an Elusive, and it pretty much ends the game, especially when you have tools to keep it alive. Okay, so moving right along, we have Sea Monsters. This is BBG's version of Sea Monsters, and of course, I try to involve some other players here. Like I said, on day 1, remember when I was saying I bit off more than I could chew? That's why there are, I think, about 5 lists here that are versions that aren't my own. It's like a couple Allen versions, Mago versions, and this BBG version of the list. And that's because, I don't have enough time to play literally all 15 of these lists. Because, of course, to be able to refine a list, you need to play it for a pretty long time and get very comfortable with what it needs and what it wants. This is a pretty great version of Sea Monsters. I think that, maybe I'll return to Sea Monsters at a certain point and make my own version of it that is kind of more refined, but this is going to be a pretty good recommendation for now. I think this does pretty well. It's a lot less greedy, using a lot of the control tools. Basically, the big difference between the day 1 decks that we saw and the reality is that very soon in the first 24 hours, people remembered that you can't really make a good list without running Ways to Stay Alive, right? A lot of early Sea Monsters decks weren't really running Whale or Grasp or Vengeance or even Vile Feast. And then they kind of quickly just started putting those tools back in. And the same is true for most lists, right? You'll see in the early days, people just cut reactive cards. I saw cuts to single combat, cuts to deny. It was crazy times, but as people get more competitive and as people need to cut down on the greed and realize they have to interact with their opponents, these kind of things get back in the decks, and that's when the decks get better. Draven Spiders. So, Draven Spiders, man, where to begin? Well, a lot of people, kind of myself included, were looking at all these new cards, looking at the new AoE tools, and saying to themselves, man, rip spiders. Spiders are toast. Well, I've got some interesting news. Spiders comes in this last week at a 67% win rate. Absolutely ridiculous win rate. Now, you're gonna ask a couple of things. First of all, Swim, you've got it on the bottom of tier 2. If you're not even looking at win rate, what are you, an idiot? Why are you even using stats if you're gonna put a 67% win rate at the bottom of tier 2? Well, like I said, win rate is a very, very tricky thing, and if stats were easy to interpret, I wouldn't need to do videos like this, honestly. Overall, there's actually a lot of reasons why I expect this list to fall off. So I want to clarify, I actually think this is a pretty solid list. Overall, I can say pretty confidently that the reason this deck has such a high win rate is largely the same reason that Burn Aggro has such a high win rate, which is for the early days of a patch, everyone is playing greedy stuff. By the way, the same reason MF Scouts has such a high win rate, and kind of paradoxically, the exact same reason why Karma Ezreal has had a low win rate. And it's just because at the beginning of a patch, everybody is messing around with a bunch of kind of greedy, slow, fairly suboptimal lists that have some kind of decent punch through potential, right? Ultimately, that's going to make aggro nuts. Every aggro deck has a hyperinflated win rate. 66% on Burn Aggro. MF Scouts was 68%. And then we've got Draven Spiders at 67%. It's just super high all around. These are kind of the three big aggro decks. Oh, also Elusive OTK. This is part of the reason at 62, I put it in tier 2, right? So overall, aggro is going to be very overstated by these stats. That's always going to be true in kind of the first week of an expansion where a lot of people are messing around with cool new concepts. Now, Draven Spiders is, in a weird way, sort of the most aggro of aggro decks. And what I mean by that is it is kind of the fastest aggro deck and at the same time kind of the most counterable. So it's going to be able to capitalize on the aggro nature of it. It's going to be able to punish these greedy decks more than the other aggro decks, even more than something like MF Scouts. But of course, MF Scouts has a higher win rate, which is why it's in tier 1 here, and Draven Spiders is in tier 2. But what that also means is when counters come in, when the meta stabilizes, people stop running greedy shit, and you kind of in more high tier ladder, then Draven Spiders ends up kind of falling off and getting a bit more countered. Now, that's kind of my prediction. I think that it is hard for Spiders to end up better than Burn Aggro, especially with some of the tools that Burn got given, but I think Spiders is still going to be a solid deck. I expect it's going to be, it's not going to be below tier 2. This is a good deck, even though a lot of people were expecting Spiders to just be dead. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised a little bit that it's sticking around, although when you think about it, it kind of makes sense at the end of the day. Even if there's a couple Twisted Fates or whatever, Spiders is still an archetype that's going to be a pretty big powerhouse, right? Anyway, on to specific changes in this list. Well, you might notice a couple of things that are different. We're running Sapling Toss and Noxian Fervor. So Sapling Toss is actually something that I've been experimenting with. I've only played a couple of games with it. Again, this is another deck that I've only been able to play 2 games of, and that makes me a little sad, but there's just too much to play right now, and I don't have time for everything, and I will try to get to this deck and make sure to refine it. I'll probably end up changing 1 or 2 things, but I'm pretty happy with where this is right now. So Noxian Fervor is basically replacing Glimpse in this list. And you might say, well, that's kind of a weird replacement. How are these cards related? And it's because they are both killing your own unit. So effectively, it is an anti-removal card. When your opponent goes in to get excited your unit, you've got a free 3 deal 3. Of course, Glimpse would have been a draw 2. Most importantly, it is your counter to Grasp of the Undying. That one single card is kind of the single biggest reason why this kind of deck had to run Glimpse, and now you've got Fervor instead. Dealing 3 to face is almost always better than drawing 2 for the purposes of an aggro deck, so Fervor is a pretty sweet upgrade, in my opinion. Sapling Toss is kind of a hard card to fit into a lot of lists, but the ability for this to help play for kind of like the board on the next round has been kind of cute for me so far. To be honest, this is kind of an experimental slot. I might take this out after I play the deck more, but I kind of liked it for the couple of games I got to play with this deck. Then we've got Twisted Fate Ezreal coming in at a very flaccid 55% win rate. Woof. Overall, I actually think this deck is kind of a little underrepresented on the 55% win rate. By the way, that's going to be the same exact reason why I think Karma Ezreal is underrepresented on the 55% win rate. I should actually explain something. I said that Karma Ezreal was bad for the same reason that Aggro is good. And that's actually sort of not exactly true. So Aggro is good right now because there's a ton of super greedy decks, right? Super greedy decks that, you know, stuff like greedy versions of sea monsters, things that are trying to like level Sejuani, level Swain, any sort of like late game combos, any leveling champions at all, super slow concepts. And you might say, well, Swim, shouldn't combo decks be good against slow decks like that? Okay, the answer is very much yes, actually, but they're not good against all the aggro that's being played to eat those other decks alive. And that's kind of the problem with combo decks here, like Twisted Fate Ezreal or Karma Ezreal. They don't have quite enough anti-aggro. I've jammed more into this Twisted Fate Ezreal. The more I've played it, the more I've jammed in anti-aggro. That's going to be like, you know, Parlay and Petty Officer, just to like help stabilize the board out a little bit. But overall, it's still never going to have an amazing matchup against aggro, and that's just how combo decks in general are going to work. So ultimately, it's a win rate that I expect to be underrepresented at 55%, but it's a pretty strong list. You know, it has all the bells and whistles you'd expect of like a pretty sweet combo deck. I think that it will likely end up being worse than Ezreal Karma, which I don't really think comes as a surprise to anybody. I think it has some potential, though. I think it really does. The interaction with Make It Rain and Ezreal is really powerful. If you didn't know, Make It Rain counts as targeting, so it can level your Ezreal on like turn 5. And I've leveled my Ezreal on like turn 5, and it's really dumb sometimes. But yeah, if you draw kind of like the awkward side of your deck, sometimes you can get powered down a little bit faster than the Ionia version. So we'll see about this one. This is actually one that I have a bit of faith in. I expect this one to kind of rise above its current win rate quite a bit, but until then, we'll have to see. And then we get to tier 3, where we get the Lonesome Milkai. Now, in the past, my tier list has been somewhat devoid of tier 3s, and I've seen some comments about that. Right now, I actually want to expand this tier list, and I want to add more kind of like tier 3 decks. It's just that I'm currently, you know, in the process of refining and optimizing a lot of tier 2 decks. So while we wait for that process to be over, there's going to be more tier 3 decks next week. But here we have Milkai. Milkai, as you know, is a deck that I was personally pretty excited for. Unfortunately, as I feared, it's not amazing. So you can see I've made some changes to it from earlier versions. We're running Petty Officer. This card has really started impressing me. The ability to get, like, you know, the choice between a Powder Keg or it being effectively kind of a worse House Spider, but House Spider is a very good card in that it's 2 bodies, is quite nice, right? The Powder Keg works really well with both Twisted Fate and Withering Wail. And ultimately, I think that, you know, any sort of like Bilgewater deck, kind of, especially if it's comboing with Shadow Isles, really wants to go into like a bit of the Keg plus Withering Wail plus Twisted Fate synergy. and this is one deck that absolutely is trying to do that. So it just helps you stall out the game and to survive. And we've cut out a bit of the kind of like plunder package to draw the card off of the opponent deck at the end. Overall, this is not a bad deck. It's a deck that came in at a pretty weak 43% win rate. But that was mostly the earlier version of the list, which was playing super greedy. It wasn't even trying to stall out the game at all. This is one of the lists, by the way. Remember I was saying at the beginning that I just didn't have enough time to give all the lists their tender love and care, and some of them were just kind of like basically, you know, kind of janky for several days while I was scrambling to update them. This is one such list, and maybe that's part of the reason why it has such a low win rate. But I looked back at this list. I got a chance to like look back through this yesterday, and I was like, holy shit, what are all these bad cards doing in here? And mostly that's just because it was ran in like a really, really greedy mentality. We weren't running like Withering Whales, which is a really, really big deal, because when you combine like these two regions and you try to play a stall out list, you really do need Withering Whales. We might even want like some amount of Grass Spear or something like that, especially against like the aggression list, right? Like this list is still not going to be favored against aggro because, you know, it is still a combo deck. Yeah, combo deck. It is still not going to be favored against aggro. Combo is anti-control, right? And therefore, you know, it's not a good time to play it. Well, aggro is just everywhere. Its win rate will come up above 43, but it's probably not going to be great. It's probably going to end up at about 50% win rate, would be kind of what I expect. Withering Whale will help against aggro, but it's still going to be a bit unfavored overall. And that is basically it. That is where we are on the first week of the expansion. That is kind of our data-driven analysis now. Again, you know, the stats are very interpretable. I've talked with a lot of other top players, and we've kind of like decided what we feel, and different people disagree, and like we all have kind of our own specific opinions. But overall, this is kind of like the most accurate conclusion that I think I can come to in terms of kind of where we can expect to go from here. Mostly, it's just important to recognize aggro is going to have inflated win rates right now. Combo is going to have deflated win rates right now because of that. And pretty much you'll see that across the board. So it just comes down to predicting what the win rates will look like when that all stabilizes. And that's very open to interpretation, right? So we'll have to see. But this kind of is how I expect things to be shaping out. And I can say that even though we had, you know, we weren't able to update these lists as fast as we could at this point in time, it's all very updated. These lists are all exactly what I would recommend for right now, for that deck anyway. And yeah, I mean, I shouldn't really have an issue like that again where, you know, I'm kind of scrambling to update decks. Like there was a point in time where I was like thinking about just pulling like half the decks from the site just because I couldn't update it. And I've done that before. There's like I've done sometimes when there's a deck that I want to update but I don't, like, I can't get around to it, I just pull it from the site and then maybe I'll add it back later when I can't update it, because again, that's how much of a stake I put in just making sure that everything on this site is always as updated as possible. And yeah, I thought about just like pulling some of the decks here. Anyway, shouldn't happen moving forward. I'm pretty happy with all of the lists as they are right now. It should be a very fun coming weeks, especially as we see the first balance patch. That should be in, I guess, a couple weeks now, I think. And yeah, overall, that's going to be it for this Meta Mondays. And I will see you guys next time.